Thank you so much for that host, Tara. I hope you're having a great day today, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I hope that the music levels are good. Let me close my door. Whoosh. I hope everybody's having a good day. I hope the music levels are okay. If anything's too loud or too soft, please just let me know. But we are here. We are back with the final scene book version. And I'm looking forward to getting this finished. We have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. We have 6 chapters to read today. Oh, good, thank you. We have 6 chapters to read today with this panicky music in the back because things are getting real. I've obviously read this book before, so I do know how it ends. And it is similar to the book in a way, or the game in a way. But thank you for being here. Without further ado, I'm going to just go ahead and jump in here. And as always, if you're new to Read Streams, just a reminder that I can only chat back to you between chapters. But don't hesitate to chat in the chat. I'll just have to catch up with you between chapters. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into chapter 11. Chapter 11. Nancy woke up to the sounds of breakfast carts being wheeled down the hall. A loud voice paged, "Dr. Evans! Dr. Evans, please come to ICU." Blinking her eyes against the morning sun that streamed through a window beside her bed, she murmured, "Where am I? What happened?" In an instant, Carson Drew was at her side holding her hand. "Nancy, it's me. Dad. Wake up," she heard him say. "Dad?" she asked as the image of his face swam into view. "Yes, I'm right here, and George is here too." Nancy lifted her head to look down toward the foot of the bed, but she groaned as a pain shot through the left side of her head. "Oh, wow," she moaned. "It feels like there's a team of hockey players going at it inside my skull." "Don't try to move, Nancy," George said, taking her friend's hand. "You got quite a bump. The doctor says you should lie still." "My arm. Is my arm broken?" Nancy asked as she looked down at the sling on her right arm. "No," her father answered, "just sprained." "It feels broken. What happened to me? What hit me? A semi-truck?" Nancy saw her father and George look at each other. "Do you not remember what happened last night?" George asked. "Last night?" Nancy closed her eyes and tried to think back. Then it came to her. "Something fell on me." "It was a movie screen," Carson Drew offered. "Do you remember anything about that?" Nancy shook her head and instantly regretted having moved as another pain shot through her. "No. I remember I heard a noise and I decided to investigate, but I made it all the way." George looked disappointed, but Mr. Drew reached out and gently patted her shoulder. "That's okay, sweetheart." "Deirdre," she said, fighting to stay awake and gather her confused thoughts. "I met with Deirdre just before it happened." "Yes, we know," George said. "She was the one who rescued you. She said she was just walking out the rear door when she heard a loud crash, and she was afraid something had happened to you, so she went rushing back." "She was the one who called the ambulance," Mr. Drew said. "If it hadn't been for Deirdre, who knows how long you might have been there before anyone found you." "She came back to the hotel lobby to tell me about your accident," George said. "Then I called your father." "I told her that you were staked out there in the lobby," Nancy said as her mind cleared, and she remembered her meeting with Deirdre. "She didn't want anyone to know she'd been to see me, especially Simon. She suspects Simon of the kidnapping." "Really?" Mr. Drew pulled up a chair and sat down beside the bed. "Tell us." "There's not much to tell. She said that on the plane here, Simon was trying to talk Brady into some kind of publicity stunt, and Brady wasn't buying it. They argued about it." "Well, that's all the proof I need," George said. "It's gotta be Simon." Nancy chuckled and turned to her dad. "George fell for Nicholas when he helped her down from the catwalk. Now she's determined to prove that it's Simon and not Nicholas." "But you still suspect Nicholas?" Mr. Drew asked. Nancy cast a sideways glance at George and saw her disapproving scowl. "I have to suspect everyone," Nancy said carefully. "And yes, he's still one of my prime suspects. The kidnapper is a man who's well acquainted with the theater. Nicholas knows the place, and he has a strong motive for the kidnapping, family loyalty, and a love of the place." "So," said a voice from the doorway, They all turned to see Nicholas standing there with a box of chocolates in his hand and a dark look of anger upon his handsome face. "Because I'm loyal to my family and want to preserve that old building, that makes me a kidnapper," he asked pointedly. He walked across the room and tossed the candy onto the foot of the bed. "I heard about your accident, Nancy," he said. "I came to tell you I hope you recover quickly." He walked back to the door where he stood with his hand on the knob. "I'm sorry you think so little of me as a person," he said with bitter sarcasm, "but I do hope you get well soon." He slammed the door behind him. The sound echoed for a long moment in the heavy quiet of the room. No one spoke. Finally, George broke the silence. "His feelings were really hurt," she said in a slightly accusing tone. Carson Drew cleared his throat. It was unfortunate he walked in at that moment. Nancy looked at her friend's troubled expression and felt terrible. "I'm sorry, George," she said, "and if Nicholas really is innocent, and I hope he is, I'm sorry I hurt his feelings." At 10 that morning, George drove Nancy home from the hospital. Hannah had her tucked into her own bed in no time at all. "I can't believe you disobeyed your doctor's orders and checked out of the hospital today," Hannah said, bustling around. "Did your father know you were going to do that?" Nancy sighed and laid her head back on the pillow that Hannah had just fluffed. "No." "Well, he's going to be very angry with you when he finds out," Hannah said, her hands on her hips. "I know," Nancy said, reaching for the bedside telephone. "That's why I'm going to call him now and tell him myself before the doctor has a chance to get to him first." "I'll make you some chicken soup," Hannah said as she left the bedroom. "And George, make sure she stays in that bed." George smiled. "Hannah's famous chicken soup could cure anything from the common cold to bubonic plague," she said. As Nancy dialed her father's office number, she knew that this time Hannah's soup would not stop her head and arm from aching. Hannah had been right, of course. She probably should have stayed in the hospital. She should have stayed, but she couldn't help Bess from a hospital bed, and if she didn't break this case today, this was the last day. In less than 7 hours, the theater would be a pile of rubble and Bess would be dead. Time was running out, and Nancy was keenly aware of every passing minute. When her father's secretary put her through to him, Nancy steeled herself for his reaction. "You did what?" he roared into the phone when she told him. "Dad, I had to. Please try to understand. You wouldn't stay in the hospital if it was me who was missing." There was silence on the other end. Nancy couldn't tell if he was angry or considering her point of view. "Dad, I understand," he said at last, "but that doesn't mean I approve. Just promise me you'll take it as easy as you can." "I'll try." Nancy hung up the phone. "So what's the plan?" George asked. Nancy bit her lower lip. "When you get that look in your eyes, I can tell you're up to something." Nancy got out of bed and before slipping into a pair of jeans and a sweater, she slipped out of her sling. Her arm was okay but felt a little stiff. "Maybe I should be hit on the head more often. I just thought of something we should have done long ago." "So tell," said George. "We need to go to City Hall and see if we can locate the blueprints of this theater. There might be a hidden room we haven't searched." The telephone rang, but Nancy knew that Hannah would answer it. A few seconds later, Hannah ran up the stairs and knocked on Nancy's door. "It's for you, Nancy. It's some man, but he wouldn't say who." "Thanks, Hannah." Nancy raced to the phone. "I have a suggestion that might help you with your investigation," the voice said in a raspy whisper. "Who are you? Are you the one who took Bess?" Nancy frantically grabbed a pencil and began scribbling with her left hand on a nearby notepad. She wrote, "Trace call, Dad's study phone." Then she shoved the note into George's hand. "It doesn't matter who I am or if I have her," the man said. "Do you want the suggestion or not?" "I'll gladly accept any help you can give me," she said, trying to prolong the conversation. "Okay, I'm only going to say this once. Take another look at your list of suspects. You haven't considered everyone who has a vested interest in the theater." "What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said." "Just tell me one thing," Nancy said breathlessly. "Is Bess still in the—" But he hung up. A few moments later, George came running back into the bedroom. "They got it," she exclaimed. "With that new equipment of theirs, they traced it right away." "Where'd the call come from?" Nancy asked anxiously. George took a deep breath. "From a telephone at 512 East Main Street." The call had come from inside the theater. End of chapter 11. Oh, that's okay if it's relatively quiet. I know it's kind of an awkward time for me to stream. Hi, Riddy. People who invest with interest are the worst. Thank you so much for the host, Timo. Is the music a little bit loud, or is that just for me? If it's not too loud for you, that's fine. I'm going to leave it where it is and just cut my own personal volume down. But if it's a little loud for you guys, I'm going to cut it down. Music seems fine. Okay, then I'm gonna leave it where it is and just cut it down a little for me. Great! Thank you guys for being here. Got a little bit of that iced tea. I feel like I'm kind of having a weird hair day, but maybe that's just me. It is very, very rainy outside because it's been a rainy month. And it's kind of making my hair poof a little bit. Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. My pleasure. Okay. I feel like I have a little thing. Oh, thank you. Oh, well, thank you for auto-hosting. And thank you for the hair compliment. Okay. Yeah, that's right. Moving along. Chapter 12. What do you think it means, Nancy? George asked as Nancy rushed from the bedroom. Shh, George, Nancy said, putting her finger to her lips. I don't want Hannah to hear us. She'll have a fit if she even knows I'm out of bed. After silently sneaking down the stairs, Nancy opened the front door. She and George quietly slipped out of the house. Oh, okay, Nancy said. There are two possibilities. First, it was the kidnapper himself who called, and he's still inside the theater with Bess. But that's not logical, George said as she opened the passenger door of the car for Nancy. Who would throw you onto a scent like that? Nancy thought for a moment. You're right, but the second possibility is that someone inside the theater knows more than we do, but doesn't want to come forward. Like Brady, George said excitedly, or Deirdre. That could be. I still haven't ruled out Simon Mueller. Still, Nancy said slowly, the caller said we hadn't considered all the possible suspects. So that implies that it's not Simon. And it means we're missing something important. But what? I don't know, Nan. Whatever it is, we'd better find out soon. I told you they aren't here, said the young woman in the city planning office of the River Heights City Hall. The blueprints you want simply aren't here. The woman pursed her strawberry red lips and put her hands on her waist as she stared at Nancy and George. Nancy leaned across the narrow counter and tapped her fingers impatiently on its scuffed surface. Are you absolutely sure? Of course I'm sure, and I'm as upset about it as you are, she said offhandedly while examining the chipped polish on the nail of her pinky. I doubt that, Nancy muttered under her breath to George. I trusted that man with those prints, and now look what's happened, the young woman said with a bored pout. What man? Nancy exclaimed. Just some guy. He came in a few days ago, asked to see the blueprints. Then he asked permission to take them down to the hall to photocopy them. Our copier was broken, so I let him take them. He brought the envelope back later and left it on the counter. Like a dummy, I filed it without looking inside. Apparently, he took them with him. She patted her carefully styled blonde hair. And he seemed so honest, too. What did he look like? George asked eagerly. What? The librarian squinted at George through her heavy blue mascara. What did he look like? He looked, regular? Did you notice anything about him, like the color of his hair? Nancy continued. It was kind of gray, she said, but not really sure. I think he was older anyway. Nancy was going to push for distinguishing features, but she realized there was no point. This woman seemed to care more about her own appearance than anybody else's. Why is everyone so interested in the theater all of a sudden? The young woman asked. Does it have anything to do with that kidnapping? Nancy looked at George, her pretty face reflecting her concern. Yes, she said, it has everything to do with the kidnapping. Nancy led George out of the office and down the hallway. We don't know much more than we did before, George said dejectedly. Sure we do. We know someone wants to stop us from finding those blueprints, and that someone might be older. And that someone may be older. Nancy looked at her watch. It was noon. George must have noticed the nervous gesture. We've got to think of something, Nancy. I'm thinking. Someone older? Haven't considered all the possibilities. Who would want the plans to the theater? Who else had a motive? Bingo, she said. Oh, I can't believe I didn't think of it before. Nancy, George said, grabbing her friend's arm, would you care to let me in on it? Louis Falcone. Nancy let the words sink in. Nicholas's grandfather? We've never considered him as a suspect, but what if he's all behind this? It would make sense. There's no way he'd want that theater torn down, and he probably knows that building better than anyone. It was all falling into place. But Nancy, there's no time to waste. Within a few minutes, Nancy had looked up Louis Falcone's address and called Detective Ryan to arrange for him to meet her at the theater later. After half an hour's drive out of River Heights, Nancy and George were in the middle of the country. They took several rural roads and finally turned into Louis Falcone's driveway. It was lined with plaster sculptures. Just look at this place, Nancy exclaimed as she and George stepped out of the car and walked across Louis Falcone's front yard. Have you ever seen anything like it? No wonder Nicholas is so proud of his grandfather, George said. Can you imagine having the talent to create such beautiful things? Nancy pulled on her friend's arm. Now remember, we're here to ask him about Nicholas. Then we'll see if he reveals anything suspicious. I hate the idea of tricking him like that, Nancy, George said, shaking her head. It's the only way, George, trust me. Besides, it's all for a good cause, because if we don't figure this out soon, Bess's... I know, Nancy, George said. You don't have to remind me. Together, the girls strolled up the stone walkway to the door of the small cottage. In answer to their knock, the door opened, and the girls found themselves face to face with one of the handsomest older men that either of them had ever met. Louis Falcone was tall, with a dark complexion like his grandson. He had a head full of snowy white hair and piercing blue eyes. Yes, he asked. His voice was rich and deep. Mr. Louis Falcone, Nancy asked, though she was sure she'd found Nicholas's grandfather. He nodded his silver head. I am, and who are you? I'm Nancy Drew, and this is George Fane. We're investigating the disappearance of our friend, Bess Marvin. You may have heard about it? Oh, yes, of course. A guarded look crossed his handsome features. My grandson told me all about you. How can I help you? Could we possibly come in, Mr. Falcone? There's a few questions we'd like to ask you if you don't mind. Certainly. Please come inside. He ushered them into his home, which was as charming and quaint inside as outside. Carved animals of all species adorned his mantel. On the coffee table was the figure of a young man sitting on a tree stump, his elbows on his knees, his chin resting in his hand. He looked very thoughtful and serious. That's a wonderful sculpture, George said. That's Nicholas, isn't it? Mr. Falcone nodded. You really caught his personality, she remarked. Mr. Falcone studied the piece as though seeing it for the first time. I was pleased with it. Nicholas is such a serious, intense boy. He always has been. It sounded funny to Nancy to hear Nicholas referred to as a boy when he was at least 23. She supposed that to his grandfather, though, he would always be a child. So have you heard any news about your kidnapped friend? He asked, motioning for them to take a seat on his sofa. Unfortunately not, Nancy said. And now I'm one of the suspects on your list, he said, looking at Nancy. Nicholas's grandfather had guessed why they were there, so she decided to be honest. Your feelings about the upcoming demolition are a matter of public record, she said, and none of us can blame you for wanting to preserve your father's and your art. Louis Falcone said nothing for a long moment. He only walked over to a small table and picked up a chunk of wood that he apparently had been carving. Walking over to the girls, he showed them the piece. Do you see this? He asked. This is just a bit of a Baroque carving, a shell. It's only a fancy little curly-Q, but I've been carving on it for 2 hours, like this. He took a sharp knife from his pocket, pressed the tip to the wood, and scooped out a small bit of the wood. When I'm finished carving this, he said, I'm going to use it to make a mold. From that mold, I can cast dozens of these shells in plaster. Then I paint them gold or silver. Mixed with other shapes, I can create those ornate borders that you see all over the theater. He walked back to the table and laid down the wood and chisel. I began learning my craft back in Italy when I was only 6 years old. By the time I was 14, I was here in the United States working as a master craftsman. You have a wonderful talent, Mr. Falcone, George said sincerely. Yes, I have, he said without pretending to be humble. But a man only creates a few truly beautiful things in his life. That theater was one of my father's and my contributions to this world. I spent a long time creating the Royal Palladium. I don't want to see it destroyed one day. I don't blame you, Nancy said. Then she asked him pointedly, Did you kidnap my friend, Mr. Falcone? He returned her steady gaze without wavering as he said, No, Miss Drew, I didn't. Nancy swallowed hard. George glanced at Falcone, then gave Nancy a sad and disappointed look. Do you believe me, Miss Drew? He asked with a half-smile. I think that you and your grandson would do almost anything to preserve that building, Nancy said, baiting him. Carefully watching his reaction, she saw his eyes flash with anger and determination. You're right, Miss Drew, we would. And if that makes us suspects on your list, then so be it. He stared at her with such intensity that Nancy found herself having to glance away. Her gaze swept Mr. Falcone's studio, and a photograph hanging among others on the wall caught her attention. She stood up and walked over to the wall. This is a picture of you, Nicholas, and Joseph Hughes, she observed. I didn't know that you were friends. I've known Joseph for years, he said. He's a good man. Do you think Joseph is capable of kidnapping? Nancy asked him. Joseph is a very capable man, he said without hesitation. He has a deep love for the theater, and I'm sure that he would do anything he could to save it. But he's a kind soul, and I can't imagine that he would hurt anyone. Nancy turned to face him, her eyes trained on his face to watch his reaction to her next question. George and I went to City Hall less than an hour ago to look at the blueprints of the theater, and they're missing. Do you have any idea who might have them? He smiled a half-smile and shrugged. I can't imagine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to get back to work. Nancy looked at George in frustration. Another dead end, and it was getting later by the minute. They said goodbye to Louis Falcone and headed back down the walkway to their car. I think he did it, George said with conviction. But he denies it, and we haven't got any proof otherwise. Nancy shook her head sadly. I know. I think if Bart Anderson had been in the room with us, he would have strangled him. Unfortunately, that's not enough, Nancy sighed. They were headed back to River Heights knowing no more than when they'd left. Hold it! Pull over, George. George slammed on the brakes and pulled into a gas station that they were passing. What's up? But Nancy was out of the car heading toward the phone. Within 2 minutes, she had Nicholas Falcone's address and was back in the car. Let's go. 1512 Rampling. Why do you want to talk to Nicholas again? George asked as she turned the car down Rampling Street. I want to try to shake him loose. If he knows anything, or even suspects anything, now's the time for him to tell us. They pulled up in front of a modern apartment house, got out of the car, and entered the building as one of the tenants opened the large glass doors. Nancy checked the directory for Nicholas's apartment number. As the mirrored elevator quickly whisked them to the 3rd floor, George looked at Nancy. I hope he's home, she said, and I also hope you're wrong. I like Nicholas. George, I'm sorry, but we can't afford not to question him, Nancy said through tight lips. They made their way down the carpeted hall to his apartment. Here it is, Nancy said, pointing to the door on their left, which was slightly ajar. Hey, look, it's open. At least he's home, George said, knocking on the door. Nancy felt her heart quicken as she waited for Nicholas to answer the door. After a few seconds, she decided to knock. Still no answer. She glanced up and down the hall, then gently pushed the door open. I hate to do this, but... The sight that greeted Nancy from inside Nicholas's apartment made her stop in her tracks. End of chapter 12. The little pout. All the staring and pouting. Monka S. Hey, Z-Fruit. How's it going? Good to see you. We have 4 more chapters to go. I'm gonna press on, because what did Nancy find in Nicholas's apartment? Chapter 13. Nancy's eyes took in the overturned coffee table, the broken lamp, the green plants that lay across the carpet in their spilled dirt. Nicholas? George called. Nicholas, are you here? Nancy echoed. but she knew even as she called his name that Nicholas would not answer. She knew that something must have happened to him. Nancy and George searched the apartment for him, afraid of what they might find. After a few minutes, they gave up looking. "I just hope he's not hurt, considering the fight he must have put up," Nancy said. "How can you tell he was in a fight? This could have been a robbery or someone searching for something." "I don't think so," Nancy said. "The place wasn't searched. None of the drawers have been pulled out, and the cushions on the furniture are still in place. And the VCR's still here. That's one of the first things a burglar takes." "You're right," George agreed. "And since Nicholas is nowhere to be seen, I wonder if maybe we have a second kidnap victim." Just then there was a knock on the door. Both girls turned and called, "Come in." Joseph Hughes entered, looking terribly worried. When he saw the condition of the room, he turned even more pale. "What happened?" he asked. "We don't know for sure," Nancy said, "but it looks as though Nicholas had some trouble." Then Nancy found herself wondering what in the world the elderly caretaker was doing there. "Is there a reason you're here, Joseph?" she asked. "What?" Joseph stared at her as though in a daze. "Oh, I mean, I just came to check on Nicholas. The kids on the picket line were worried about him because he didn't show up." Joseph looked around the room again, then began to murmur to himself. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he said. "Nobody was supposed to get hurt. I never meant for..." "You never meant for what?" George asked, jumping on his words. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" "Nothing." He closed his eyes and shook his head violently. "Nothing. I just meant that..." He opened his eyes and looked around the room again, becoming more agitated by the moment. "Oh, Nicholas, if anything happens to that boy, it's going to be all my fault." Nancy walked up to him and caught him by the arm. "Why, Joseph? Why would it be your fault?" Joseph looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Then he seemed to realize what he'd said. "Never mind," he said, pulling out of her grasp. "Just never mind." He backed away from her toward the bedroom, his hands in front of him as though he were warding off an evil spirit. Nancy wondered what she had said to set him off. Whirling around, Joseph raced into the bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it behind him. "Joseph? Joseph, open up!" Nancy shouted as she pounded on the door. "George, get my purse. I need my picklock. Hurry." George brought Nancy's bag, and in a minute Nancy had found her tool, jimmied the lock, and opened the door. They raced into the room but found it empty. "Where is he?" George shouted. "Over there," Nancy said, pointing. "The window's open." They ran to the window and squeezed onto the fire escape. Far below, they saw Joseph scurrying down the escape, nimbly jumping from one level to the next. There was no point in chasing him. He had too much of a head start. They both watched the old man as he hit the ground running and disappeared into the nearest alley. They turned to each other, both of them thinking the same thing. Nancy was the first to say it. "He sure is spry for such an old fellow." "Spry enough to climb around on a catwalk," George observed. "Definitely." Nancy ran back into the living room and grabbed her purse. "Come on, we're gonna go find Bart Anderson. We still can't prove anything, but when we tell him about Joseph, he'll have to postpone that demolition." 15 minutes later, the girls stood in Bart Anderson's outer office. "I'm telling you for the third time, Mr. Anderson is out. Out, you know, not in." His secretary bristled at Nancy and George as they stood in front of her desk, demanding to see her boss. "So why is his dark blue Mercedes parked out front in his space?" Nancy asked. She found that her voice came out sounding far calmer than she felt. "I don't know," the secretary answered. "Maybe he went for a walk somewhere, but he isn't here. I'll have to ask you again to leave and stop pestering me, because I have work to do." To illustrate her point, she turned to the typewriter, slid in a piece of paper, and began to type furiously. "Come on, George, she obviously has her instructions not to let anyone see him." At the door, Nancy paused and said over her shoulder, "When you see Mr. Anderson, please tell him that we were here today, and tell him that we'll be in touch again. Today." As soon as Nancy and George were out in the hall, Nancy looked at her watch. "The best we can do is wait in our car to see if he shows up, but only for a couple of minutes. We need to get to the theater and confront Joseph." Minutes later, they saw Bart Anderson walk out of his office building toward his blue Mercedes. "There he is," George said. She started to open the car door. "Wait a minute, George," Nancy said. She watched as Bart Anderson glanced nervously around before getting into his car. The girls ducked down out of sight below the dashboard. "He definitely looks like a man with something to hide." Nancy peeked over the dashboard. "Let's follow him and see what he's up to." George bit her lower lip. "You got it." They fastened their safety belts. 10 minutes later, they turned off the main highway to follow the Mercedes down a narrow dirt road. "Where do you think he's leading us?" George asked as she peered through the cloud of dust raised by the car in front of them. "We'll find out pretty soon," Nancy said. "This road can't be very long." "Wait, hold on, look." Anderson had stopped his car. "Let's wait here until we see what he's up to." Nancy reached into her purse and pulled out a pair of miniature binoculars. He's going into a trailer, she said. It looks like one of those portable little offices that builders move from one construction site to another. Nancy lowered the binoculars and looked at George. We have to know what he's doing in there, she said. Absolutely, let's go. The girls left George's car and sneaked up to the trailer. They circled the trailer until they came to the side where there was a tiny window. What's he doing? George whispered as Nancy stood on her toes and looked inside. You're not going to believe this, George, but he's got Nicholas, Nancy exclaimed in a hushed voice, and he has him tied to a chair. George craned her neck to see in. Both girls winced as they heard Anderson's voice boom through the thin walls of the trailer. I know you've got that girl, he roared, and if you don't tell me where she is right now, I swear I'm going to kill you. End of chapter 13. Oh, hi. Oh, bye, Z-Fruit. I probably missed you, but bye-bye. Have a great day with Splatoon. Wait, are you Bart Anderson ready? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I thought you was a nice lion. I'm just kidding. I know you're a nice lion. Thank you. Thank you. We have 3 more chapters to go. That's fine for sleepy lurking. I hope this is relaxing you. Ruh-roh. Did I find your secret? Okay. Chapter 14. We've got to help him, George said, her eyes wide. We're going to, Nancy answered. She quickly climbed the 2 steps leading to the door. Taking a deep breath, she threw the door open and charged inside. Bart Anderson was standing next to the tied-up Nicholas. What's going on here? Nancy demanded. What do you think you're doing to him? George added indignantly. Nicholas opened his eyes wide. Nancy, George, what are you doing here? He asked. But never mind why you're here, he added. I'm just glad you are. This man is a lunatic. How did you... You followed me here, didn't you? Anderson said. Why, I ought to call... No, you really shouldn't, Nancy said flatly. Look, I was just trying to help you find your friend, Anderson protested. I don't think you can solve one kidnapping by committing another, Nancy said. Nicholas looked extremely relieved as George worked on untying him. That's what I've been trying to tell this guy. He had his goons grab me at home. Then they brought me here and tied me to this chair. Anderson could see he was beat. He turned and stomped out of the trailer, slamming the door behind him. That's crazy, George said, but why kidnap you? Why not try to help us find Bess instead? Nicholas shook his head. I don't know, except it looks to me like Anderson's running scared. He's got a lot of money riding on being able to demolish that theater today. But he can't if Bess is still in there, Nancy concluded. I'll bet you anything that after I talked to Detective Ryan, he called Anderson to say there might be a delay. You're probably right, Nancy, George said, finally freeing Nicholas's hands. He gingerly massaged his chafed wrists. I don't know why everyone thinks I did it. Because you have the perfect motive. Nicholas quickly looked away from both of them. Are you protecting someone, Nicholas? Nancy asked. Please tell us. She walked over to him and knelt beside his chair. Is it your grandfather you're protecting? Is he the one who took Bess? Nicholas struggled with the words before he let them out. I don't know. I hope not, but he might be. What makes you think he might have done it? George asked. Because he loves the theater so much? No, it isn't that. What is it? George asked, probing. Nicholas took a deep, shaky breath. Remember when Joseph got that phone call from the kidnapper? The one he told us about when we were all standing there in the lobby? Yes, of course, Nancy said. Go on. Well, Joseph said the kidnapper called the theater the Royal Palladium. And the theater hasn't been called that for years. No one would call it that except someone who had been around in the old days. Nancy finished for him. Like your grandfather? George asked. Nicholas nodded. Like my grandfather. Or, Nancy thought, Joseph Hughes. The pieces were starting to come together in her mind. Joseph's an old-timer. He might have called it that himself. We only have his word for it that there was a phone call at all. But Joseph couldn't have kidnapped Bess. George said he was making the introduction for the movie over the PA at the time. Remember we heard it in the women's dressing room? We heard Joseph's voice, so we assumed he was in the sound booth at the same time, Nancy said. But he could have easily made the tape ahead of time and rigged the PA system to play at the right moment. Do you really think Joseph would be capable of kidnapping someone just to save that building from destruction? George asked. I know Joseph, Nicholas said. He's a good person. He thought for a moment. But he does love that theater more than anything. It's possible he might do anything to save it. Of course, Nancy said. I should have thought of this before. That's why Joseph's been staying in the theater night and day. And he's the one who found Bess's earring, George added. Not only that, but I just realized something else. What? Nancy asked her. Joseph was the one who thought of searching the stage again yesterday when we heard that tapping noise and found the room that she'd been in. He led you to it, George. He must have wanted us to know she was still there. Nancy found herself excited, worried, and relieved at the same time. If Joseph was the kidnapper, then they were on their way to finding Bess if they still had time. The trailer door opened and Bart Anderson stepped inside. He was wearing a broad grin that made Nancy uneasy. Anything that made Bart Anderson that happy had to be bad news. I've just been on my car phone, he told Nicholas, and I pulled a few strings at City Hall. I had to cash in on some long-standing favors that I'm owed, but it was worth it. What was worth it? Nancy asked, afraid she didn't want to know. I moved the demolition time up. You did what? George exclaimed. Anderson smiled and pointed to the thin gold watch on his wrist. That's right, that building's coming down in 15 minutes. I don't want any of this foolishness to interfere with my project, and the only way to stop it from interfering is to finally destroy the place. 15 minutes! Nancy reached out and grabbed the front of Bart Anderson's jacket. We just solved the case! We know who's kidnapped Bess, and we're sure she's still in there. Anderson looked suspicious and doubtful. Do you really, or are you just trying to stall me again? It's Joseph Hughes, Nancy said. It has to be. The janitor? Anderson asked. He's a lot more than the custodian. Joseph is the soul of that theater, Nancy said. Her heart was in her throat. She had to make him believe her. Please, Mr. Anderson, she continued. I don't have time to explain all the details to you now, but we really do have very strong reasons to suspect him. You have to stop that demolition. Our friend is in that building, and if they tear it down, she will die. Not more than 5 minutes later, Anderson's Mercedes was hurtling down the dirt road, sending a whirl of dust into the air. Can you drive any faster? George urged. It won't help your friend if we get ourselves killed before we get there, he said grimly. But from the passenger seat, Nancy saw him press the accelerator closer to the floor and the speedometer jump another 10 miles per hour. Try to get your crew on the phone again, Nancy suggested. Or better yet, let me try. You've got your hands full driving. She dialed the number he gave her, but there was still no answer. That means they're at the theater already, Anderson said. Do you think we'll even make it in time? Nicholas asked, leaning forward from the back seat. I don't know. My crew's pretty efficient. Once they start, it won't take them long to leave the place. 10 minutes later, the Mercedes screeched to a halt in the theater parking lot. As the group piled out of the car, Nancy reached down to Anderson's tape deck and grabbed a cassette tape out of it. What's that for? Nicholas asked when he saw her shove it into her pocket. But Nancy didn't have time to explain that she would need it to bluff Joseph. She was already running toward the building. She followed Anderson as he raced toward his crew, who was assembled at the side of the building. Hey, stop! Hold it, you guys! Bart shouted. But they couldn't hear him above the noise of the machinery and the pickets' cries of protests. To add to the bedlam, Brady, Deirdre, and Simon chose that moment to arrive. Seemingly from out of nowhere, 20 screaming girls appeared and surrounded the stars, waving bits of paper and pens. Bart ran up to the man operating the wrecking ball. Hold it, Charlie! He shouted. But he was too late. Nancy watched in horror as the huge steel ball crashed into the side of the theater and its wall collapsed in a cloud of dust. End of chapter 14. Yeah, it's totally okay that you're being that you're quiet. I know you've got stuff going on, Tara. Don't worry about it. Please have a good rest of the day. It's totally okay. Yay! Let me drink some of this water. See, I think it's curious because, like, in the game, Bart Anderson isn't even a character, and if the wrecking ball comes, it's game over. And, like, in the book, it's part of it. Okay. Chapter 15. "You can't go in there," Bart Anderson shouted to Nancy, Nicholas, and George as they ran through the front door of the theater. "The building's unstable now, and it might—" But they didn't hear the rest of what he said. Their only thought was of their friend and her safety. They paused for a moment in the lobby. Plaster dust swirled around them and drifted down, covering the black and white marble floor at their feet. "We have to find Joseph," Nancy told them as she anxiously searched the empty lobby. "My guess is he's in there going down with the ship, so to speak." "I'll check downstairs," Nicholas said as he headed for the staircase. He ran up the steps, taking them two at a time. "I'll search the office," George said, taking off in that direction. Nancy ran into the auditorium. The deserted room was half lit by the stream of light that poured in through the gaping hole in the side wall. This was the heart of the theater, and something told her that he would be there. He was. Nancy hurried to the back of the dark auditorium where he sat huddled in a seat. His head was down between his knees, his arms wrapped over his head. "They're gonna do it," he said tearfully. "They're gonna pull it down and kill us all." Nancy sat down in the seat beside him and put her arm around his shoulders. "No one's going to die, Joseph," she said as gently as she could. "They've stopped the demolition." She looked over at the gaping hole in the side wall. Through the space she could see Bart Anderson and his crew milling around outside. Slowly Joseph lifted his head and looked around. He could see for himself they had halted the destruction. "How'd you get them to stop?" he asked. "We found out for sure that Bess is in the theater, and we know that you're the one who took her." He looked at her in disbelief for a long moment. Then suddenly his dazed look dissolved. He jumped to his feet, and before Nancy had a chance to grab him, he ran to the back door of the auditorium. "Oh, no, you don't," she cried as she ran after him. "You got away from me once today, and that's enough." She burst through the doors that were still swinging from his escape. As she ran into the lobby, Nancy caught a glimpse of Joseph as he disappeared down the steps leading to the lower level. "Oh no," Nancy thought. "If he gets down there into that maze of practice rooms, I'll never find him." Instead, Joseph turned to the left and down the hall. Nancy chased him down the hallway. It was a dead end with some dressing rooms and a costume room at one end. "I've got him now," she thought. She saw him jerk open the door to the wardrobe room and disappear inside. But by the time she ran into the room, he was gone. Nancy shook her head in disbelief. There were no other doors out of this room. The man came and went like a phantom in the old theater. Then she caught a movement out of the corner of her eye. The costumes that were hanging on a rack to her right were swinging ever so slightly. She ran to the rack and paused only a moment before sweeping the clothes aside with her hand. She expected to see Joseph standing there huddled behind the costumes, but nothing. He was gone again. Nancy scanned the wall for a seam. Joseph couldn't have disappeared into thin air. There had to be another secret door here, just like the one Bess had disappeared through. There was. Part of the wood paneling was several shades lighter than the rest, and one board in particular stuck out from the wall. Digging her fingernails into the crack between the panels, Nancy pulled on the board. A thrill of triumph passed through her as the panel opened, but it quickly faded when she saw only darkness ahead of her. There was a musty, dank smell like a basement that had been closed for a long, long time. She reached into her purse and took out her penlight. Its golden beam pierced the darkness, and she saw a narrow staircase leading up into still more darkness. Nancy carefully climbed the steep, rickety steps that twisted and turned, first to the right, then to the left. There was no banister, only bare walls on either side. Nancy shuddered as a spider's web brushed across her face and down her neck. As she climbed, she kept her ears open for any sound from above. She had to find Joseph and make him tell her where Bess was. If he got away, they might not ever find her. With her flashlight pointed at the steps, Nancy followed the set of footprints that Joseph had left in the thick dust. In the distance far above, she heard the sound of his feet pounding as he ran. Then the footsteps stopped. Was Joseph lying in wait for her? Nancy slowed her pace and tried to see into the darkness above her. Quietly, she made her way to the top. Through the blackness, she saw a thin line of light streaming in. Another secret door. Carefully, she pushed the door open, bracing herself. Joseph could be right on the other side, but when Nancy opened the door, she saw that he had led her all the way to the hallway on the 3rd floor. She was standing in the corridor outside the projection booth. Joseph was at the end of the hall and heading for the stairs that led back down to the lobby. Nancy's heart sank. He was about to get away again. "Joseph!" she cried out. He turned to face her. Then, hardly believing her eyes, Nancy saw George and Nicholas appear on the stairs right behind Joseph. "There he is!" George shouted. "Get him!" Nancy yelled. They raced toward Joseph. Nancy saw the panic in the old man's face when he realized he was trapped. George and Nicholas were behind him, and Nancy was bearing down from the other side. Turning on his heel, Joseph darted into the projection room. "We've got him!" Nancy cried. They all charged into the room after him. They had him cornered. There was no way for him to escape now. Joseph backed up against the wall, his eyes wide with fear. "It's okay, Joseph," Nancy said. "We know why you did it, and we understand, really." "How did you find out?" he asked. She reached slowly into her pocket and took out Anderson's cassette. "We found the tape, the one you recorded the movie introduction on." Joseph's eyes darted from the tape in Nancy's hand to the projector. Nancy caught the glance. His eyes told her where the real tape was. In an instant, she was taking the projector case apart and looking inside. "Here it is," she announced proudly as she pulled a cassette tape out. George ran toward the projector. She leaned over Nancy and reached inside. "What is this?" she asked. "There's some papers here, too." "The missing blueprints," Nancy exclaimed. So Joseph was the old man who took them from the archives. "Where is she, Joseph?" Nicholas asked. Joseph looked more like a frightened child than an old man as he stood there in the corner trembling. Nancy smoothed the wrinkled blueprints against her thigh and then held them out to Joseph. "Show us, Joseph, please. Show us where you've hidden Bess." End of chapter 15. Says all of that while hitting fist in the other hand. Oh my goodness, get him. Got him. It's fine, I'm totally fine with the yelling commentary by Riddy. All the evidence. Yay, claps. My face, though. We have one more. Okay, you guys ready for final chapter? It's the final chapter. Da-na-na-na. 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 Okay. Chapter 16. Nancy watched as a variety of emotions played across Joseph's wrinkled face. Fear, sadness, and finally shame. "I never meant to hurt young Bess," he said in a shaky voice. "I was gonna hold Brady, but she was there and—" "I know you didn't," Nancy said soothingly. "I showed you the earring," he said, "and I told you that I heard her crying out. I wanted you to know for sure that she was here in the theater, but I couldn't take you to her. As long as I had her, there was some hope I might save the theater." "But why did you try to scare Nancy off at the same time?" George asked, confused. "You mean the flowers, the light, and the movie screen?" Joseph asked. "I never meant to hurt you, Nancy. I just thought that if things kept happening at the theater, you'd know not to stop looking there. You'd realize that the kidnapper and Bess really were still inside." Nancy sighed. It was so illogical. But all of Joseph's thinking seemed confused and twisted. Obviously, his love for the theater outweighed all of his reason. "I think I understand, Joseph." She held out the blueprints to him. "But please, show us where Bess is. They've stopped the demolition, and you can tell us where she is now." Joseph blinked several times, holding back his tears. Then Nancy watched as he slowly reached out his hand. His finger trembled. Nancy held her breath. Finally, after a long pause, Joseph pointed to the spot where he had hidden their friend. "An ice depository?" Nancy asked as she and George followed Nicholas up a steep, narrow flight of stairs toward the attic. "What's an ice depository?" "It was the air conditioning system in the old days," Nicholas said, panting from exertion. "There's this narrow space between the attic and the ceiling of the auditorium. They used to put big chunks of ice there in the summer to keep the audience cool." "Did it work?" George asked. "I don't know, I wasn't around back then, I just remember hearing about it." "So where is it?" Nancy asked when they reached the attic. Nicholas referred to the paper in his hand. "Somewhere about here." He dropped the blueprints and began examining the wide boards in the floor. "The opening where the ice was put in has been boarded over, but if Joseph has been in here, there should be some loose planks." Suddenly a board came up at his prying. The girls caught their breath. "Bess?" George cried. They paused a moment to see if they could hear anything. They did. A faint movement from the dark recesses that Nicholas had just uncovered. "Bess, is that you?" Nancy called. "She's in there," George said firmly. "I just know it." Nancy knelt beside the hole and shined her flashlight into the darkness. That was when she saw the most welcome sight of her life, a patch of teal blue and a sparkle of sequins. And it was moving. "It's her!" she cried. "She's alive!" "Here, let me get her out," Nicholas said, gently easing Nancy aside. "It'd be my honor, really." Nicholas slipped easily into the narrow space and disappeared for a while. In less than a minute, he reappeared with a dirty, disheveled, but happy Bess in his arms. He lifted her out of the hole, who handed her over to George and Nancy, who instantly smothered her with hugs and kisses. "Oh, Bess, we were so worried," George said while laughing and crying at the same time. "We didn't know where you were, or if he'd hurt you, or even who had you. It was awful." Nancy grinned in relief. "Hold on, George. Before you have your reunion, let's untie her and take this gag off her mouth." George quickly untied the towel from Bess's mouth while Nicholas and Nancy unbound her hands and feet. When Bess opened her mouth to talk, her voice was hoarse and shaky. "What took you guys so long?" she asked. With that one question, Nancy was reduced to tears. At last they had found their friend. "Just look at the two of you," George said, lying there like ladies of leisure. She stood at the foot of Bess's hospital bed. In the bed next to Bess lay Nancy. Both of them looked more bored than ill. "Hey, I'll trade places with you anytime you're ready," Nancy said. "The only reason the doctor's making me spend the night is to get even with me for running out this morning." "And what are you in for?" George asked her cousin. 5 years to life," Bess complained. "Actually, just overnight like Nancy. They just want to keep an eye on me to make sure I don't croak or something." "Hey, is this slumber party for girls only, or are fathers allowed?" Carson Drew stuck his head through a door. Then he showed them a box of Hannah's chocolate chip cookies. "I bear sweets and good news." "Cookies!" Bess looked ecstatic. "Wow, I felt like I haven't had a chocolate chip cookie since my previous lifetime." "Didn't Joseph feed you?" Mr. Drew said, handing her the tin. "Just pizza," she said, munching on one of the cookies. "He didn't want to leave the theater to get groceries, so he just kept ordering out for pizza. I will never look at another mushroom and pepperoni in my life." Nancy and George giggled. "Sure," Nancy said. "You know, I still can't believe it was Joseph. I thought I recognized his voice at one point, but he kept me blindfolded the whole time. He must really love that old theater." "He meant to grab Brady, you know. He never planned on taking you," George added. "Yes, he told me that. Said he meant to get a boy because boys were sturdier and less afraid than girls, so of course I had to be a good sport and hang tough to show him how wrong he was." "And you did," Nancy said with a grin. "I'm just glad he didn't hurt you," she added. "My wrists and ankles are a little sore from the ropes, but that's about it." She took another cookie from the tin. "What's going to happen to Joseph?" she asked. "After we put you in the ambulance, we handed him over to the police," Nancy said. "They arrested him on the spot. I suppose he'll be charged with kidnapping and extortion." "That's too bad," Bess said. "Even though he put me in one of the worst experiences of my life, I do feel sorry for him. Maybe my testimony will help him in court." "I'm sure it will," Mr. Drew assured her. "And now for my good news." "Oh yes, he brought good news with his cookies," Nancy exclaimed. "So let's have it." "Thanks to the efforts of Nicholas Falcone, his grandfather, and the Landmarks Committee, the demolition of the theater has been canceled permanently," he announced proudly, "and the city has declared it a historic landmark." "Bart Anderson must be livid," George said, not bothering to hide her glee. Mr. Drew cleared his throat. "Actually, Bart Anderson has other things on his mind." He was arrested too, along with Joseph. "He was?" the girls asked in unison. "For what?" Nancy asked. "Kidnapping. Remember, he had Nicholas taken from his home and physically restrained him. He's in deep trouble with the law." "This looks like a party. Can we join?" Deirdre asked as she peeked into the room. "The more the merrier," Nancy said, "but Bess wants to know if you brought pizza." Bess groaned. Deirdre walked into the room, followed by Brady and Nicholas. When Bess saw Brady, she gasped and pulled the sheet up to her neck to cover her ugly hospital gown. Instinctively, she put her hand up to her hair, but that was a lost cause. "Hi, Bess," Brady said as he walked over to her bed. "It's really good to see you again." "Do you remember me?" she asked breathlessly. "Of course I do." His green eyes twinkled and he smiled his easy, heart-stopping smile. "You're just as pretty as I remember you, too. Maybe even prettier. I can't tell you how bad I feel that you were kidnapped instead of me. I would have traded places with you if I could have." "Oh, Brady, how sweet. I mean, I didn't really mind." Brady pulled a bouquet of red roses out from behind his back. "These are just a small token of my gratitude," he said, handing them to her. "As soon as you're out of that hospital bed, I'd like to take you out for dinner. Maybe some dancing if you're up to it." "Oh, sure, I'd love to." "Thank you." He leaned down and placed a kiss on her cheek. Bess looked as though she were about to faint away. Then she blushed bright pink and Nancy thought she had never seen her friend look more lovely. Bess put her hand to her cheek and drew a long, shuddering breath. A kiss from Brady Armstrong? She exclaimed. I almost feel like it was worth getting kidnapped. End of book. Bess, please. Oh, let's catch up. Oh, boy. A secret passage. Gator got her. Hi, guys. Haley Williams shirts. This is literally a work shirt, but thank you, I guess. Hi, Rob. Yeah. I don't think that a kiss on the cheek from Brady Armstrong is ever worth kidnapping. Like, come on. Come on. Bess, please. Alright, we finished it, friends. We did it. We did it. The next book that will be read on stream is going to be The Vile Village. Secrets of Unfortunate Events. Oh, nice. Yeah, you did. That's okay. The next book that will be read on stream is The Vile Village, and then after that will be the book for Secret of the Scarlet Hand. Best please. Yeah, it's good that you're here at any rate. Hope you're having a good day. Sorry I'm not streaming longer. I just have a lot of chores I gotta get done today, and errands and stuff that I need to go run. But, I'm glad you guys hung out with me. Thank you for those who were here, even just briefly. All right. Oh, Carly. Feels bad, man. Yeah, Chorins hopefully won't be too bad. And then I really just want some, like, chill time. I haven't had any time just to, like, sit around and, like, catch up on YouTube, so I'm hoping to get a little bit of time like that today. But thank you guys so much for being here again. I really appreciate it very much. I'm sorry that I'm about to finish stream. I know this was a short stream, but this was a short book, so I just did it into little tiny, like, chunks there. But, yeah, I hope you have a great time. Guys, have a great rest of your day. I'll leave you with a little bit of music, but please enjoy the rest of your day. It was great to have you. I hope to see you again soon. Please take care of yourselves, and as always, much love from me to you. Bye-bye.